This month, we're tackling a study that went around claiming that the longevity benefit of lifting weights disappears once you train more than 1 hour per week. It's a real paper in a real journal, and the claim is wrong. We'll walk through why. We'll also get into whether a GLP-1 flattens your mood and your motivation along with your appetite. Same calories, more weight loss argument that will not die, and what you can actually do in the gym when you have chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and this is the Barbell Medicine Podcast. All right, well, let's get into this first one. This is about lifting weights for more than 1 hour per week. The question is, the paper by Moma et al. Says that the longevity benefit of lifting weights disappears once you get past about 60 minutes a week of training. This seems unlikely to me. I think we share your skepticism, but let's talk about why. I think that the 60 minutes thing, we need to walk through the whole study. Because it did become a headline for a while. This came out in 2022. It was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine by Moma and colleagues. They took 16 prospective cohort studies together and looked at whether lifting on its own is tied to living longer and how that changes with how much lifting you do. Let's start with some good news. Any strength training versus none, unsurprisingly, improves things like mortality. In this particular review, it was a 15% lower all-cause mortality. I think there was another one that showed like a 23% one from Dankel. Basically, if you met the muscle strengthening guidelines. If you do lifting and cardio together, this particular review showed that reduction in all-cause mortality dropped by about 40%. Now, the problem here is there's like a dose-response curve, where in this particular group of studies, it showed that the more lifting that they did, the improvement or the reduction in mortality, it sort of started to drift back towards neutral. It never crossed the threshold showing it was harmful, but just the benefit wasn't proportional to the amount of exercise that they were doing. Now, some people might interpret that and say, well, look, if the improvement is reducing, then lifting more is bad. Other people might view that in a way I kind of looked at it was like, well, how many people are actually doing a bunch of lifting? And when you look at the actual study, there's just not that many people that were doing a bunch of lifting. And further, the sort of protective benefits never went back the other way, showing harm. So with nobody in these cohorts in this study really doing high lifting volumes, and further, the way they collected this data was at the beginning of the study, you just kind of self-reported how much lifting that you were doing, and then they followed these people. Now, I'm not saying this is a terrible study design. It's just we got to know the limitations of the study. It's just messy here at high volumes. The one thing that I kind of take away from this is that any lifting beats nothing. I don't know that that's surprising to anyone, but the magnitude of benefit I think is surprising. If you talk to somebody who wasn't doing any lifting and you said, look, just doing a little bit has this potential to have a big benefit. I don't know that motivates them to start lifting, but it certainly could be an interesting fodder for discussion. There's a newer, longer study that actually came out of Harvard this year by Zhang, followed about 147,000 people up to 30 years and remeasured their training as they went along rather than just asking a questionnaire at the beginning. The benefit actually went up to 2 hours. Now, there was a continued sort of dose-response relationship up to 2 hours. Now, again, that doesn't mean lifting for more than 2 hours per week is necessarily harmful. There's just not that many people up there. And further, you get a lot of confounders, as when we do this sort of analysis. But I think overall, our heuristic, and Austin, you can correct me if I'm wrong or maybe overstating it. We still think there's this dose-response relationship between exercise, generally speaking, and benefit. Where that shakes out for resistance training is probably lower than most of what our listeners would want to hear, right? Because they're like, I just want to lift, 4 times a week, 5 times a week. And we're like, for health benefits, it probably plateaus, right around maybe double the current physical activity guidelines for health benefit, maybe even a little lower. But for conditioning, that benefit keeps kind of tracking on, there's some benefit from continued more and more increased volumes of exercise. Does that kind of square with what you think about, like the sort of dose response relationship?
Sort of, although there are things that even that claim leaves out here. And that's part of why this type of study doesn't really get me terribly interested or excited or impact what I recommend to somebody. It's just like, I think you said that you weren't you weren't wanting to call this a terrible study design. I tend to not use inflammatory language like that in general, but I'm not pleased with, the choice of metric here, in particular, like time of resistance training. Mm-hmm. It's like if somebody tells me I strength trained for 30 minutes or 60 minutes or 2 hours or 4 hours, I still don't particularly know what you did. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether it was appropriate for your level of adaptation. I don't know what you're counting as resistance training. I don't know any of the other like variables to determine, was this like a reasonable strength training program in general, and was a reasonable match for you and your level of adaptation and your goals. And so, when you say that maybe it plateaus at double the guidelines, that still, leaves out what is the actual outcome that the person is achieving. Because you've made this case before, is that, yeah, participating is beneficial, but actually getting the adaptations is the thing that is best, kind of correlated to the health impacts. If you were doing a strength training program that is in fact making you stronger, right? Mm-hmm. And so then that brings into the equation, well, is the amount of training that you do, how does that relate to the outcomes that you get? And that is what is going to be different for everybody. Some people mm-hmm. need, to do more per week to get incremental additional adaptation, whereas others, the freaks among us, the very training sensitive, the closer to beginner territory, can make substantial progress on relatively little training. So there's multiple additional layers to this that make this study and any sort of claims that emerge from it in terms of, if you train up to this many minutes per week, it's beneficial. Beyond that, it's no longer beneficial. I find that not only unconvincing, but actually pretty implausible. Now, if I'm translating this to like a clinical scenario where I'm sitting in front of a patient doing some exercise counseling, you could frame this as if I was talking to them about whether they're strength training or their cardiorespiratory, their aerobic training, and they're currently doing nothing. How strong of a case can I make for getting them from doing nothing to doing 30 minutes a week? A very, very, very strong case. Mm-hmm. From there, how strong of a case can I make for getting them from doing, say, 30 or 60 minutes up to 60 to 90 minutes or, 2 hours a week? I can still make a pretty good case for that, right? If they're already doing 2 hours a week of, say, strength training, how much stronger of a case can I make for them pushing it to 3 hours, to 4 hours? I think it is fairly obvious to most people that purely from a health standpoint, the strength of my case is going to diminish for health outcomes. Now, if the person says, look, I have made a lot of progress so far, but my progress in strength adaptations, in muscle gain is really starting to taper off, that's where I now suddenly have a stronger case of, we could probably be doing more, be doing things differently. But that's not really a conversation that's happening as much in the clinical realm. That's more a conversation that's happening in like the coaching sort of realm for people who are highly motivated for those particular adaptive outcomes. But for people who I'm working with who are either for general health purposes, who have cardiovascular conditions that are just trying to get healthier, who are on GLP-1 medicines trying to maintain their strength and muscle. Again, that strongest case that I can make, is for the initial bit. And that case weakens the larger of volumes we're talking about, unless the person has very particular performance goals, or if they just want to. But I'm not telling them if they say I want to, that like, don't go over this many minutes because you're going to die sooner or compromise your longevity, gains from this kind of thing. I just do not buy it. And I would not use a study that looked at mainly time without, again, a sense of what does the actual program look like, which is kind of hard to do in most of these types of studies because everybody's doing different stuff. Who knows what their programs are coming from? Who knows what the actual level of intensity is that the person, it's just too messy, right? And so this is fundamentally like useless for me in like clinical decision-making and like guidelines, I would say.
Yeah. What you would want from like a research, approach for this is like some way to grade the exercise and to take heterogeneous programs, different programs, and then distill them down to a number that actually represents the training load on some level.
Some kind of strength training stress index or something like that.
Yes, which I've been working on for a long time. And further, the sort of metrics it's associated with, because to your point, the thing isn't just like how much training the people are doing. It's really what is their response, because of effectively what you would want a study like this to tell you clinically is that, look, by achieving X outcome, here is the risk reduction, right? So that whether that's strength, whether it's power, whether it's cardiorespiratory fitness, these are all things that can be tested. And so you'd want to say, look, by achieving this particular level of strength, power, cardiorespiratory fitness, you maximize your benefit, or right. And then after which, what this study, maybe the headline was insinuating is that, well, once you go past this certain amount, maybe not so good, which we have not seen. We have not seen that for strength, where it says, look, the strongest quartile or tertile or however you would split up, various strength categories has like worse outcomes. Never seen that. So yeah, I would want an exercise program to generate the outcomes that we want and then measure those against, if that's a performance outcome, how does that stack up against a health outcome? And then we'd have a better answer. But overall, I think our general heuristic is that generally speaking, more exercise, more better for health and certainly for fitness, where you sort of kind of get diminishing returns, I think changes for each particular fitness adaptation. So strength, power, cardiorespiratory fitness. I think it's higher for cardiorespiratory fitness, that ceiling, lower for strength and power. But I don't think I could convince somebody to do less strength training because I think it's harmful for them. The only way that I could rationalize it being harmful is if it is likely to drive injury and subsequent decrease in activity, or someone's doing so much resistance training that they're effectively unable to do any conditioning because they have no time, right? But I don't think that's really what these studies are pointing at.
Yeah, I think that's a fair framing. And this reminds me of, I got a consult question from a patient recently who brought up the question of basically, are there any strategies to mitigate the downsides of, strength training, for example, on the cardiovascular system? I'm like, what downsides? And then they shared with me some resources that they had found. They had used some AI tools, some searching to find some evidence, but what was coming back was all of the evidence in something we talked about way back 150 podcast episodes ago in the extreme exercise hypothesis on ultra endurance sort of training and the increased or the association or increased risk of things like atrial fibrillation, coronary artery calcification, things like that. And I was like, all of this is in ultra endurance, ultra high volume and high intensity aerobic, sort of stuff. Not to demonize that or to say that that's necessarily bad for longevity. There are certainly trade-offs, but that is like when you're getting at very, very, very high volumes and high intensities of ultra endurance sort of activity, not applicable to strength training, is not a thing that is observed. Where, for example, if you do, too many sets per week of deadlifts or something, that you're going to be at markedly higher risk of developing, atrial fibrillation or something like that. That's like not a thing that's ever been shown. So good news, not something you need to worry about. And the vast overwhelming majority of people are not, in fact, meeting those kind of thresholds for what would be considered, sufficiently ultra endurance level volumes of activity that would be conferring some degree of risk. And the people who are most often consciously choosing that because they love to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the biggest risk from doing too much exercise, it happens to be musculoskeletal injury. And then, you could go even further into your point, very consciously choosing to do a lot of conditioning exercise. Sure, increased risk of atrial fibrillation, which can be managed. And ultimately, those people aren't dying any sooner either. Right. It's just like, no biological free lunches here.
Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by ButcherBox. One thing I try to stay consistent with is keeping enough protein in the house so I don't end up ordering takeout a few times a week. That sounds simple, but between work and everything else, the grocery store trip is usually the first thing that gets cut. And ButcherBox fixed that for me. They deliver grass-fed beef, organic chicken, wild-caught seafood, and more, all sourced to the standards they are transparent about. Every box is customizable, so you pick the cuts and the proteins that fit how you actually cook and what you're actually going to eat. It's like having a butcher on call who already did the sourcing homework for you. And let me just tell you, the quality is legit. I've been grilling a lot lately. It's summer here in San Diego, and the meat has been excellent. It tastes great. It shows up right to my door, exactly what I want, and I don't have to think about it. I don't have to make a trip. That's the whole point. It's an easy button for your food. Now, whether you're grilling on the weekend, meal prepping for the week, or just trying to get a real dinner on the table on a Tuesday, you've already got something good in the freezer ready to go. Go to butcherbox.com/barbell to get $20 off your first box, plus your choice of free ground beef for life, or free chicken thighs or top sirloins in every box for a year, with free shipping always. That's butcherbox.com/barbell, BARBELL. Be sure to use our link so they know that we sent you. This podcast is brought to you by Factor. The last few months have been a real time crunch for me. I've been finishing the book Signal, and between that, training, and everything else I've been doing, cooking has been a real challenge. And Factor has been the thing keeping my nutrition from going by the wayside. Having meals ready to go that I can heat up in 2 minutes and actually feel good about eating has made a real difference on the days where I just don't have those 30 minutes to stand in the kitchen, especially when it's late at night. Factor meals are chef-crafted and dietitian designed. They're ready to eat with no prep and no cleanup. They have over 100 menu items rotating every week, including new options like salmon burgers, shredded pork, and collard greens, plus add-ons like protein shakes and pumpkin cheesecake. Over 175 banned ingredients, so the stuff that you probably don't want in your food isn't going to be there either. I use Factor, and I bet you could benefit from it too, especially if your schedule gets tight. Food is usually the first thing that slips. This keeps that from happening. Head over to factormeals.com/BBM50off and use code BBM50off to get 50% off and one free breakfast item per box for a year while supplies last until October 31st, 2026. That's code BBM50off at factormeals.com. Again, BBM50off at factormeals.com. See the website for more details. This podcast is brought to you by Figs. If you're in healthcare or you're in training for it, back to school season means you're about to spend a lot of time in scrubs. And Figs just dropped new colors and back to school styles. And right now, everything on their site is 20% off. Now, during my medical training, I found out that the standard hospital scrubs were not designed for anyone squatting, period. Bending over to examine a patient was like a trust fall, just hoping that the seam would hold. That's how I ended up trying Figs. They're cut with actual stretch, they fit like real clothes, and they survive both the job and the squat program. They're also antimicrobial, and they hold up to the laundry abuse that this job requires. They also have footwear, compression socks, and outerwear. And 20% off site-wide is the best deal they run. So if you've been meaning to replace your scrubs or stock up for a new rotation, this is the time. Go to wearfigs.com, get 20% off everything through August 11th. No codes needed. That's wearfigs.com. This podcast is brought to you by Quince. End of summer is when I start thinking about what I actually want in my closet for the next few months. You know, not a full overhaul, just swapping out the stuff that's worn out and filling in some gaps. And that's what keeps bringing me back to Quince. They do everyday staples really well. Their organic cotton tees are soft and hold up wash after wash. Their cashmere sweaters are legitimately good for the price point, and they transition straight into fall. If you need pants, their premium denim and tailored chinos start at just $60, and the fit and fabric are on par with brands charging 3 or 4 times that. Ask me how I know. Now, everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands because they work directly with the factories and skip the middlemen. You are paying for the materials and the construction, not a logo or marketing campaign. Now, one of my go-tos this summer has been their organic cotton mesh stitched sweater polos. I have it almost every color, and it's one of those pieces where you look put together, but you're actually comfortable, which is why these are going to stay in my rotation for the fall. And Quince goes way beyond just clothing. They've got premium bedding, bath essentials, cookware, travel gear. It's one of those brands where you buy one thing and end up recommending it to everyone. Both Lee and I have their sheets, and they're great. So upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/BBM. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/BBM. Hey, it's Jordan here. This is an ad for a subscription that removes ads, including this one, which is a good way that you never have to hear this again. And you can do that by signing up for Barbell Medicine Plus, which is now 25% off annually through August 13th with the code PLUSANNUAL. Now, the ad-free listening feed means this exact minute of your life, you'll never have to do this again. You also get member-only AMAs with Austin and I, plus bonus episodes, early access to our content, articles, and more. Plus, you get discounts on training templates, 10% off, 15% off consults, 25% off courses and seminars, plus member-only sales. If you're going to buy any of that stuff anyway, you now have solved the ad problem by shopping, which is not how I thought this was going to play out. But mostly, it's how people support the show, and that support is the reason it keeps going. So sign up for Barbell Medicine Plus, use code PLUSANNUAL through August 13th. This has been an ad about itself. Now back to the show. All right, next question is on GLP1s. Will we ever sufficiently talk about GLP1s such that all of the questions have been answered? Methinks no. So this question is, I'm probably going to try a GLP-1. My main concern is psychiatric. Does the, quote, hedonic stuff that these act on only affect appetite? I enjoy gaming with friends and other things that you'd call hedonic, including libido. Have you noticed GLP-1s affecting people's motivation to do stuff, not counting eating, or their mood going down? So he knows the appetite effects, cold, and he wants to know if the drug will dull his mood, his drive, his enjoyment of everything else. To me, there are three pieces to this. One is reassuring. One, we genuinely don't know, and one, he isn't really asking about. The first is reassuring to me. It's the mood. On average, holds or gets a little better. Now, there was some thought that maybe there was an increased risk of depression, maybe there was an increased risk of suicidal ideation, for example. That was like some preliminary data coming out. But when those data have been analyzed and taken to their conclusion, the best controlled data coming out of the STEP trials in people without major psychiatric illness found depression scores a touch better on average with semaglutide than placebo. Now, whether this is clinically meaningful or not, that's up for debate. The authors said no, but it doesn't show like, look, higher increased risks of depression, even though there was maybe a thought that could happen. Suicidal ideation is the same. It's the same story on that. There was a scare that has been walked back. In early 2026, the FDA asked for the suicidal ideation warning to be removed after reviewing 91 placebo-controlled trials covering about 108,000 patients, plus over 2 million real-world users, and the European regulatory body landed in the same place. So this Ozempic makes you depressed sort of claim, we can kind of nip that in the bud. The second piece to me is less clear, and before I get into it, I want to tag you in, Austin, since you're the one actually prescribing these. When a patient is on one of these and you check in, do they ever describe anything past like the appetite change, something with their drive, mood, or wanting things, quote, less across the board? What have you actually seen?
I will say a few things, because this is a fairly common concern and conversation that I have with folks. So yes, I have seen some of these things. No, it is not the most common response to these medicines. So some good news for this person is that it is not typical for patients who are starting these medicines, particularly when properly dosed. And properly dosed means always starting at the lowest dose of the medicine, for them to experience this. More often, when I have seen more of this kind of suppression of mood, of interest, of motivation, it tends to arise at the highest doses, and more often with Zepbound than with Wegovy or semaglutide. There's some thought and conversation in this space of, is there some contribution of the GIP element to that? I'm not going to get into the details of the neurobiology just yet, but that's kind of part of the conversation. The other things are that even that in that situation, it is frequently manageable. So a lot of the time, what I end up doing with these folks is lowering their dose. So say somebody's on 15 milligrams of tirzepatide or Zepbound, which is the highest dose, which takes many months to get up to that dose, just to be clear. And you have a lot of opportunity and time along the way to notice how you're feeling, to not continue increasing, to go back down, to adjust your dosing strategy. But let's say you get up to 10 to 12 to 15 milligrams. And you're experiencing something like this, then oftentimes I'll drop them down maybe by 5 milligrams or so, from 15, say, down to 10, see how they do. Sometimes we can augment their therapy, combine it with another tool like bupropion, which is a medicine that can have some kind of activating type effects, can improve some of this motivation, this energy, this drive. And I've had actually really quite good success in using this strategy with most of the patients that I have who have experienced this. But again, the big picture caveat that I want to kind of re-emphasize here and illustrate is that this is not a typical or a very, very common concern or effect that I'm observing in most patients using these medicines. It affects a small minority. And of that minority, it tends to be at the highest doses. The reason why that's good news for you is, well, if it's affecting the minority, you are unlikely to be affected. If you are, nothing about starting these medicines is a permanent effect. If you notice something that you don't like, talk with your prescribing clinician. They should ideally know how to handle this. If not, I do. We can get sometimes creative with dosing strategies and try other agents and other options. And you can also stop at any time. And that's not actually a problem either. I have lots of patients who have existing psychiatric conditions, some of them having actually quite severe psychiatric issues, things like, bipolar disorder, things like that are on actually fairly intensive psychiatric mental health medications, some with prior history of very severe depression, with suicidality, with hospitalizations, who are actually doing fine on these medicines, again, with monitoring and things like that over time. But this is not a concern that I want to kind of blow out of proportion in terms of what I'm observing in real life using this with like lots and lots and lots of people.
Yeah. I think, when the mechanism was kind of sussed out a little bit, look, these drugs act on the brain's reward pathway, this sort of wiring that creates the urge to want to do something with less payoff than you'd otherwise expect, then people are like, could this be useful? Or researchers certainly were like, could this be useful for substance abuse, right? Yeah. Which on the one hand was like a silver lining. And then other people took that to suggest, well, maybe I won't like anything. And there's been some effect, people reporting like flat effect and stuff like that. There's some interesting data here. Researchers have investigated what happens if you give people with alcohol use disorder a GLP-1 and see what happens. Well, they drink less, for example. So there's a study came out last year in JAMA Psychiatry, 48 people with alcohol use disorder. They were on low dose semaglutide, so Ozempic Wegovy, or placebo, and they were put in a bar lab, which can I go? Like it's just a simulated drinking environment. In any case, it cut how much they drank and they craved, and they also cut their cigarette consumption as well. There's a second trial recently published in The Lancet, which was bigger and longer, and it showed the same thing. Now, this has never been studied for like gaming, right? It's never been studied for socializing, other hobbies or whatever. So all of like the brain imaging studies and the mechanisms hasn't really been applied here. We do think that these sort of, if you want to call them an anti-reward type effect, we do think that it reaches past food, but we don't know to what extent. And the hobbies, in this case, are pretty much untested. So that's an open question. Yeah, sure, a few people, like as you mentioned, a minority can report feeling flat, but that's more anecdote than anything else. And I don't think there's a huge signal otherwise showing like a lot of people experience this, and it's a big problem. I would be concerned if there was a big libido effect, but I suspect if anything, it would probably get better, mainly because the effect of the drug itself. Like if someone's appropriately prescribed these medications, they are carrying excess body fat. And, in men who are carrying extra body fat, that tends to reduce testosterone, particularly if they have a high amount of visceral adipose tissue, again, surrounding your internal organs. And because these drugs do such a good job at reducing that, testosterone levels actually tend to go up. Now, libido itself is more complex than just testosterone level, but we do think that this would likely improve. I think you can see sort of a confounder, though, if people are not eating enough, generally speaking, and they're losing weight very quickly. So that fatigue can sort of overwhelm any sort of hormonally mediated improvement in libido, but that's like a kind of separate issue. But the third question, and the one that I think needs to be asked whenever we discuss these sorts of things, mainly due to the still fairly prohibitive cost, where are people getting these medications from? So if somebody's sourcing a GLP-1 through like Research Chemical or gray market sort of peptide, I have concerns about that. Maybe not just related to like anhedonia, right? Or like reduced enjoyment of activities, but mostly just like safety, because you don't really know the dose that you're getting. For example, you don't really know if what is labeled on the vial is what you're actually getting. Plus, if you're getting it through those sources, I do wonder about the monitoring. So all of that sort of kind of tilts the risk-benefit scale firmly, to me at least, towards the risk sort of situation. But I think overall the psychiatric risk is relatively low, if anything, likely to be beneficial, as long as somebody's not really taking an unregulated peptide from the gray market here. So Austin, you've got patients on these medications. Now, if this individual was your patient, acknowledging this is not medical advice, this is for infotainment purposes only, and they're kind of express these concerns about anhedonia, having a sort of flat effect, how would you counsel him on that? Would it be mostly like, hey, we're going to monitor this as we go along, we're starting low, this is minority, or anything unique in your sort of counseling here?
Yeah, I want to first be clear about what is the goal of therapy. Because one of the things that wasn't listed in the question is like, what is the indication for using a GLP-1 medicine in this situation? Is this somebody with obesity, with metabolic disease, with cardiovascular disease, with fatty liver disease, with chronic kidney disease? All of those things, or any combination of them, really strengthens the case for benefit outweighing potential risk. That's the first thing. Now, if on the other hand, he says, I'm super lean, jacked, healthy, I'm wanting to use a GLP-1, whether prescription, FDA approved, or gray market Retta, so I can prep for a bodybuilding show. I'm not saying he's saying this, but or she is saying this, but that obviously changes the potential benefit to potential risk sort of calculation there, right? So that's the first thing, because we're always framing these therapeutic conversations around what are the potential benefits that we are looking for, what is the goal, and what are the potential downsides that we should be aware of and to kind of take into account. And then once accounting for those things, can we negotiate a mutually acceptable strategy to navigate that path together, right? And so if this person has clear clinical indications for their use, or that if they don't, they are willing to accept potential downsides, despite the lack of a clinical indication for its use, then yes, the plan would be, hey, we're going to start at the lowest dose. We will monitor how you're doing, knowing that we have creative dosing strategies, options for combination therapies to address side effects if needed, or we can always go back down in dose, or we can stop, and it is a reversible effect, not something that it tends to be permanent. And again, I would reiterate that the big picture of observation in practice is that this is infrequent. If it happens, more often at the highest doses that take a while to get to, and is something that we can mitigate by just going back down. And so that flexibility is quite nice about these agents.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's about as new as medicine gets. Now let's tackle one of the oldest questions in the field. Is a calorie really just a calorie? So the question is, can you discuss the nuance around the studies showing weight loss when protein goes up, even at the same or higher calories? There's one energetic, that just means at the same calorie level. There's one energetic high protein trial in particular. I've also heard people say keto lets them eat more and still lose weight. Yeah, so on its face, these two scenarios look like they break physics. You're eating more calories, presumably, and still losing weight. But if you dig in, it's kind of a farce. Okay, so let's start with we'll back up a little bit and start with the phrase that everyone kind of fights about. Is a calorie really a calorie? Just a calorie? Yeah, it is. 100% of the time, a calorie is just a calorie because it's a unit, just like a second or a meter or, measures time or distance. A calorie is a unit of measure for energy. That said, calories in, calories out. Is a calorie just a calorie? I think what people are getting at when they're trying to poke holes in that relationship is that on either side, calories in, calories out, both sides are dynamic, and just stating the relationship is not terribly helpful advice for most folks. And I think that's fine. Two things can be true. A calorie can just be a calorie, but the advice to just eat less, move more, or it's all just about energy balance may not be great advice. And I think that's fine. Now, with respect to protein, I think it's fair to say that protein pushes both the calories in and calories out. It affects them both in a way that favors weight loss. I think it's fair to say that, but there's some nuance here because effectively the effects are modest. So when you increase dietary protein intake, a few things happen. One, it tends to displace other foods. Americans typically eat quite a lot of protein, about 1 to 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. But most of that protein is from ultra-processed or highly processed sources, tends to have a lot of fat and other things, which increases energy intake. And so when people make this, quote, conscious choice to eat more lean protein in particular, it can displace some of those higher calorie options and other options that don't have a lot of protein but otherwise do contain a lot of calories. So that could reduce energy intake, for example. Increasing dietary protein intake also tends to increase the thermic effect of food because protein costs more to digest than carbs or fat, but it's mostly a small effect, if any. We know that, it does take more energy to break down protein, but how that affects total daily energy expenditure, we don't really know because everything kind of is dynamic. When you increase one variable, the system isn't closed. Everything else changes too. So I don't know that increasing dietary protein actually increases calorie burn in a way that produces weight loss. I think the main factor here is it reduces intake overall. So the study that was sent here is from 2020, Hagiat in British Journal of Nutrition. It was 12 weeks. And basically they looked at the effect of a high protein diet versus a standard protein diet in women. Now the diets that were prescribed to these individuals were the same in calories. That was the prescription, which differs from how they were actually implemented because they actually ate different levels of calories. In the study, in table 1, the high protein group reported that their intake fell over the trial, while the standard protein groups actually held the same. So the average in the high protein group, they ate about 90 fewer calories per day, closer to 130 fewer calories by the end of the trial. They also cut carbohydrates, which drags water and glycogen out. And so they were eating less calories. And what do you predict happens when people do that? Well, they lose weight. There was an improvement in body composition here, showing increase in lean body mass, decrease in fat mass, unique to the high protein group. which isn't a surprising finding when it's combined with resistance training, but it was surprising in this study. So you have to look a little deeper and you look into the methodology and how did they assess body composition, bioelectrical impedance, which is pretty poor, a bathroom grade device, if I'm being charitable.
Yikes.
The authors themselves say, look, this wasn't a gold standard, and which begs the question, like, why did we use this for that? It just is not sensitive enough to discern relatively small changes in lean body mass. And in the defense of BIA, bioelectrical impedance, DEXA wouldn't be good either in this short period of time, mainly because you just need large changes in actual muscle tissue and fat mass for it to be picked up on either one of these tests. Bioelectrical impedance is just worse, right? So ultimately, the people in the high protein diet ate less, so they lost more weight. And the body composition changes in this relatively short study were mostly a result of a measurement error. Although, again, I would expect a higher protein diet up to a certain level, probably about 1.6, 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day to improve lean mass if people were resistance training. Although if people weren't resistance training, I don't really think it's going to move much for muscle mass. To me, the keto version dies the same death. When people say they went keto and they ate more and lost weight, really what happened is they felt like they were eating more, but actually their calorie intake went down. This has been investigated. People said, hey, you can only eat these types of foods, in this case, a ketogenic diet, and they tend to eat less some of the time. What's more interesting to me about the ketogenic diet data is that is a relatively short-term effect. When you look at 6 months, 1 year, the weight loss, quote, advantage disappears relative to other types of diets. Now, if somebody wanted to follow a ketogenic diet in perpetuity, they hate carbs, war on carbs. Okay. There are ways to do that. That's fine. And that's ultimately fits their preferences, allows them to eat the correct amount of energy. But the idea that ketogenic diet somehow breaks the law of physics where people can eat more calories and lose weight has never been shown. Never been shown. So, Austin, how do you handle this? When a patient swears they're eating more and losing weight, or they're losing on keto without counting their calories, what does the conversation look like? I'm going to guess. You say, nice. but I'm very curious how you address this.
Yeah, firstly, it would be, nice, cool. Keep it up. That's great. I think that the other aspect of this conversation, though, is definitely wanting to be on the same team with the patient. And that means that if the ultimate goal of this is for their health, then yes, as long as they are making progress, losing in a way that they prefer, then yes, I'm on their team for that. But I also want to make sure that they are on my team in the sense of, hey, we want to make sure there's not detrimental effects happening from this diet. And so the reason I bring that up is depending on the particular food choices, the way that this keto diet is set up, there can be, even if you're losing weight, can be some other detrimental effects. For example, if you are consuming very high amounts of animal-derived saturated fats, as we've talked about many times before, that can have some detrimental effects on your blood lipid profile, for example. There might be some other impacts that are adverse on your insulin sensitivity and things like that. So I would definitely want to make sure, hey, we want to make sure you're very sufficiently active. And if I can get them to agree that we should aim to, make the most progress we can while avoiding objectively detrimental effects, then we can say, hey, if we see that, like, say your blood lipid panel goes haywire, like your, LDL goes up, your triglycerides go up, your, things like that, would you be open to making some, tweaks, some modifications to this keto diet within the realm of your preferences as much as possible to mitigate that? And I think that there's likely to be a way to, thread that needle. Maybe we swap out some of the, dietary fat sources for more unsaturated sources from seafood sources, from plant-derived sources, things like that, and then aiming to get the dietary fiber intake up to our standard recommended targets for whichever, population the patient falls in. So typically, getting them up to, say, 30, 40 grams of fiber a day if they're willing to go that high, or as high as they're willing to go within the confines of their diet. And then that might confer some beneficial effects on those otherwise detrimental effects. So I think that's the two big pieces, is making sure that we are getting the benefits we're looking for and mitigating the harms. If we can do those two things and the person wants to stay keto, like, sweet, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And further, if somebody was like, I want to increase my dietary protein, and, what can I expect? What to expect when you're expecting? It's like, well, it depends where you're starting at right now. So for example, if a person's consuming, 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, and they're like, I'm going to go up to 1.6. And I'm like, okay, Well, provided that you're resistance training, right? I suspect you're going to have get a bigger benefit from your exercise. I do suspect that increase in protein is going to displace other higher calorie foods from your plate. And so net, I would expect some benefit. Now going from like 1.6 to 2.2 or more, I don't expect that benefit. On the other hand, it could further displace other foods from your plate. And so some people may find that approach successful in the short term, but long term, that has not been borne out either, where it's just like, no, just jack your protein up and you're going to lose more weight. It's like, well, at the end of the day, it all comes down to energy balance one way or another. But I think overall, you and I are aligned. We're not calling this person a liar and breaking out the physics for them and saying, look, the law of thermodynamics. Yeah, there was no point. Just like telling people to eat less and move more, that is not particularly useful advice. Telling people that it all comes down to energy balance is probably also not useful advice. All right. Our next question has to do with lifting and chronic fatigue syndrome. The question is, what's the best weightlifting to do when you have chronic fatigue syndrome? I go weeks where I barely have the energy to shower. I want to increase my lifting. I sometimes lift weights in bed on my worst days, but my boyfriend says that isn't doing anything. What are some exercises that won't make me need to sleep for 2 days? All right. So some people are going to say, look, chronic fatigue syndrome, this is made up. It's not a real illness, but it is. And it's often referred to as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS. And in 2015, there was a National Academies of Science panel that laid out formal criteria for diagnosing it. Now, the thing that separates it from just being, quote, tired is what happens after somebody exerts themselves. So in this particular instance, she does something, whether it's physical or mental, and instead of being wiped out that same day or being tired that same day, there's a sort of extended sort of crash for multiple days, in some cases even longer than that. And it's out of proportion to the effort that was done. Now, her question says it plainly. Basically doing some light lifting, and then I need to sleep for 2 days. That sort of delayed crash is called post-exertional malaise, and it's one of the key features of this particular condition. There's a really interesting case with a pair of identical twins where one has chronic fatigue syndrome and the other doesn't. Same genes raised together, so you can't chalk it up to genetics or lifestyle. Now, both did a hard exercise test 2 days in a row. The healthy twin repeated the performance on day 2 just fine. The twin, though, with chronic fatigue syndrome dropped about 13% at the anaerobic threshold test on the second day. Basically the point where the effort tips from manageable to much harder. And it's not just a twin curiosity. Run the same 2-day test on groups of these patients and the same pattern holds. They show a bigger drop off on day 2 than healthy people do. You can't really talk yourself out of that. Unfortunately, there's no real proven program or like exercise routine for this. It hasn't been studied well. But the one thing that everyone agrees on is basically staying under the sort of limit that sets off a crash. Now, this is a relatively new update because for a long time, the idea was, look, we just got to push these patients. We just have to like tell them just add a little bit more every week, this sort of graded exercise. Unfortunately, that just is like forced progression, and it turned out to be wrong. Now, it's also wrong in others, like people without this condition, but that seems to be a little bit more, again, disruptive in this population. And there's just lower stakes. If you kind of overdo it, in a healthy person, they're like, man, I'm sore for longer. I'm tired for longer. My performance has decreased, but they bounce back relatively quickly. Usually these folks can be prolonged. So the guidance is flipped, and this happened, in the last few years. As far as her boyfriend goes, he's half right. Look, lifting weights in bed is probably not going to build as much muscle or strength as like going to a gym and doing a, quote, real training session. But that's not really the point. It's better than doing nothing. Thing one. And two, she's getting something out of it. For exercise to really accomplish nothing, it has to be so submaximal, so light, so easy that it does not challenge her or the person at any level, which is pretty hard to do. You'd have to like really fabricate something, something unnatural for that to happen. Ultimately, to me, this is like doing what you can, when you can, where you can. And I think that's certainly better than nothing. So the way I would approach this from a practical perspective, I generally think that shorter bouts of exercise are likely a better place to start than longer ones, and would do longer rests. So instead of having like 6 exercises on the docket, maybe you only have 2, right? And instead of resting, only 2 to 4 minutes, maybe it's 4 to 6 minutes, which you can get away with if you only have 2 exercises, for example. I would also generally stick with lower RPE targets, probably more at 5, 6 compared to 6, 7, or 8. I would also, instead of trying to force progression with a fixed rep range, for example, use double progression, wherein you would have a rep range of like 6 to 10 reps, for example, and only add weight when you could max out all of the sets at 10 reps at a given load. And so it's going to be a little bit more of a gradual progression, delayed progression that we're sort of constraining with that rep range. I would also have a backup plan. If, for example, someone is feeling like, I don't really have it today, not just like I feel sore, if I don't feel quite as strong as normal. In this case, it's like my energy levels are really, really low. Maybe all they can do are isometrics, where you're creating force and not really moving dynamically. Or maybe it's just much lighter. And then the other thing that I would add that's kind of unique here, we often talk about monitoring session RP, like how hard was the effort, what was the whole training session, whereas a session RP 10 would be like, that's maximal. It's the most I've ever done. And SRP 1 is like, that was rest. I didn't do anything. We should measure that, right? But also, I'd want to see what happens the next day and 2 days later and 3 days later, because this sort of disruption and prolonged sort of decrease in energy level, sometimes called an energy envelope, happens days later. And so you would really want to have, be kind of like monitoring this post hoc just to see like, is the program that we're on right now, is it adjustable enough? And is it like actually like meeting the person where they're at? And I think that it's just harder to do when you have to sort of look at monitoring only directly after the session or during the session. So it needs to be a little bit longer than that. So Austin, this is where you're better than any study. If this were your patient, someone with chronic fatigue syndrome who actually wants to lift and is scared of the crash they've been experiencing, how would you go about counseling them? What does the sort of strategy look like day to day? And how do you talk about it without sort of noceboing them, for example?
Yeah, I will be totally upfront that this is not an area of a great deal of expertise or experience for me. I think that this is a very challenging syndrome. Number one, it is poorly understood. It is multifactorial. Different people experience it in very different ways, and they likely have arrived at this kind of like final syndrome probably in different ways as well. So that deviates a lot from kind of our we'll call it more traditional like medical diagnoses, if you will, where patients tend to more often present with a kind of more prototypical pattern, because so much of diagnosis involves things like pattern recognition, and there might be a relatively common or shared underlying pathophysiology. Here, it might be different pathophysiologies that converge to manifest in a similar way in a diverse set of patients, ultimately not super well understood. Maybe some people have greater or lesser degrees of mitochondrial problems. That's a total hypothesis. And again, I'm not an expert in this area. So as a result, that's why I am both reluctant to sign on to the idea that I'm better than any study here, but also B, that I'm probably not the best person to be giving confident advice on this. I think that a lot of what you proposed is probably reasonable, although I would also point out that even the best plan that you could propose within those kind of constraints may still fail for a person for reasons that we may understand and may not. And so much more so, I think the idea of individualization, and again, as I alluded to earlier, being on the same team as the person is probably the most useful thing here. So trying to get a sense of like, how do you feel that I can help you best? Are you willing to work together, collaborate on this, iterate on this over time? What are the goals you're trying to achieve? Can we like mutually agree on an acceptable starting point with a plan to modify as we go? Because you're right that historically the idea that, these folks, they have this syndrome, but they still are capable of tolerating a stress and adapting to it just like anyone else. It's like, might be a little bit of an exception to that rule, because when they have been pushed, they tend to do worse. And so there's some other path, some other strategy that's going to need to be worked out. And again, it's going to need to be super individualized to the person and what they're willing to do. I think that both of us would hesitate to sign on to an idea of, well, you're just not going to be able to exert yourself, and just like, bed rest is going to be the move for you. That's not something you're likely to ever hear us say for somebody, but rather that prospectively, without, meeting with the person, working with them, collaborating on this over time, it's going to be tough to propose something upfront that is anything more than like a reasonable guess. And that's kind of what you came up with there. And with a if-then sort of thing, so that they have some confidence that, hey, we got a backup in mind. And I like that you included some ideas for backup strategies. but you need to be on the same team. If there's an adversarial sort of relationship, if there is, doubt in the relationship of, oh, well, I don't think that I can tolerate this, but they're making me do it or recommending that I do it, like you're already kind of on the wrong foot. So you need some rapport, you need some trust, you need some collaboration, you need some iteration, you need a lot of time. If it were me, I would probably be like, hey, can we find somebody with like way more expertise than me in this space who can guide you? Because I've done that for other things that are not necessarily like I will claim to know a lot about a lot of things, but certainly not everything. And this is one of those areas where, unfortunately, I do not have a great deal of that expertise. And a lot of that is an artifact or a consequence of my typical practice setting over the years. Working in hospital medicine for a lot of the time, and not having like brick and mortar clinic where I'm seeing patients with these sorts of chronic debilitating illnesses limits my degree of experience in working with them, and so then that limits my confidence in giving advice on the internet about it.
Yeah. Well said. And I think, if you're a coach working with somebody like this and you've never seen it before, never dealt with it before, I don't want to scare you off and say, we don't want to scare you off and say, look, you can't touch this, little MC Hammer reference. But I would just generally be more conservative and more dynamic with your recommendations, readiness to change what you're doing. And then further, if you get in a few weeks or a few months and you feel like you really can't get purchase on like, this is where the person should be starting, generally speaking, for the bones of a decent program. You just can't find that entry point, then finding somebody with some more specialized expertise would be the move. And I think, we see that all the time in medicine. It's like, look, this looks like something I feel like I can handle. And then, if that doesn't really shake out, okay, cool. We're going to actually we're going to get a consultant on board who's going to help us because they have more expertise. That's a handful of the best questions from this month's Direct Line. The full episode, every question our members sent in, goes out to our Barbell Medicine Plus and Premium members every month. Now, if you want the whole thing each month and you want your own questions to be answered on the show, head over to barbellmedicine.com and jump in. From everyone here at Barbell Medicine, I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. That's Dr. Austin Baraki. We'll catch you next week and every week right here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast.